Welcome and thank you for joining us on the 2020 webinar From Appalachia to Alaska, Supporting Rural Communities and Individual Artists. I'm Sherilyn Seeley, Program Manager for GIA. According to a National Governors Association report about rural support, creative sector initiatives are most effective when attuned to the particular creative assets and needs of rural communities. This is critically important as we advocate for needs-based and community-centered approaches to support. However, while rural communities have common assets and challenges, not all rural communities are the same. In 2019, we discussed the needs of remote indigenous communities, and this year, we're exploring frameworks that are specific to the Central Appalachia region and Alaska for organizations and individual artists. We're glad to have Roy Agloinga, Program Officer at Rasmuson Foundation, Stephanie Hyre, Senior Program Officer of Greater Kanawha Valley Foundation, Enzina Marrari, Program Officer at Rasmuson Foundation, and Thomas Watson, Owner and Executive Director of Rural Support Partners, joining us. They're going to discuss what makes their communities and support unique and what funders should keep in mind when supporting organizations and individual artists in rural communities. Rasmussen Program Officer Roy Agloinga is the co-author of an Inupiat dictionary and currently serves as Board Secretary for the White Mountain Native Corporation. He's a trustee for the Western States Arts Federation and a former council member for the Alaska State Council of the Arts. Stephanie Hyre is the Senior Program Officer of the Greater Kanawha Valley Foundation. In her current role, Hyre leads the Foundation's education and arts initiatives by working with nonprofits to convene stakeholders, leverage resources, and improve the lives of Greater Kanawha Valley residents. Enzina Marrari serves as a program officer for the Rasmussen Foundation, based in Anchorage, Alaska. She's originally from Chicago and a former professor and grant manager for Access Alaska. Most recently, she oversaw all aspects of the 1% for Art program as curator of public art for the municipality of Anchorage. Thomas Watson is a social entrepreneur with 20-plus years of experience in nonprofit and business management. In addition to community economic development, network building, and philanthropy. He is the owner and executive director of Rural Support Partners. We're glad to have them joining today. At the very end of the presentation, I will be joining to facilitate a Q&A. With that, I will turn it over to our presenters. Welcome, Roy, Stephanie, Enzina, and Thomas. Thomas, why don't you get us started?
Great. Thanks so much, Sherilyn. I so appreciate the opportunity to be here today, and thanks so much for everyone joining us on the call. We certainly appreciate your time and your interest in our work. At Rural Support Partners, we do lots of things and wear lots of different hats to help advance the new economy of Central Appalachia. The hat that I'm wearing here today is that of the Backbone Support Organization for the Appalachia Funders Network. In that role, I'm going to do two things this afternoon. One, I'm going to provide just a bit of context and history of Central Appalachia, and then I want to give a brief overview of the Appalachia Funders Network before turning it over to Stephanie, who's going to talk more in depth about the arts and culture group of the Appalachia Funders Network and their effort to uplift and support arts, culture, and creative placemaking across the region. So let's start with a little bit of geography. The Appalachian Mountain Range runs all the way from Alabama up to Maine. We are located in Central Appalachia. That includes the full state of West Virginia and parts of 5 other states. We are often recognized as the cultural heart of Appalachia, and we are generally the place that people are talking about when they actually talk about Appalachia. Within this geography, we have several things that we're known for. First would be our beautiful mountains. And you can see from the top photo here of why we call it the Blue Ridge Mountains. You can see in the bottom left a picture of the Great Smoky Mountain National Park. You can see on the bottom right the Blue Ridge Parkway, 2 of the most visited parks in the United States. We are also known for our abundance of natural resources. We are one of the most biodiverse regions in the United States or in the world. We have one of the largest stocks of hardwood trees in the U.S. We're a large producer of coal, natural gas, and other minerals. And a fun fact, we were once the largest producer of salt in the United States. But in addition to our beautiful mountains and the abundance of natural resources, we're also known for our historical high levels of poverty. Now, you got to start asking yourself, how can such a beautiful region with such massive amounts of natural resources that has generated so much wealth over the past 150 years, how can a region like that be so poor, as you see on the map here? Well, economists would call this the paradox of the plenty. which says that in places rich in natural resources like Central Appalachia, they tend to have less economic growth, less democracy, and worse development outcomes than other places. You can see in the previous slide the effects of mountaintop removal. Everybody knows the problems associated with fracking, abandoned mine lands, and timber extraction. But the paradox of plenty not only takes a toll on the environment, it also takes a toll on our people. The poverty that you see on this map is both structural and generational, in that the massive amounts of wealth generated from the extraction of our natural resources didn't stick in the region itself. It went to outside corporations in other states with very little reinvestment back into the people and the places of the region. Large corporations like Industrial Harvester, Union Carbide, and the Ford Motor Company not only own the coal mines, but they own the towns, they own the houses, they own the company stores, and they paid people in script up until the 1960s. So a lot of folks in our region were never able to build assets, so almost nothing got passed from one generation to the next. A mono economy not only means that industry gains most of the wealth, they also control a lot of the politics of the region. So most of our policies, our infrastructure, our economic development strategies, and our systems were set up to support extractive industries to the detriment of local people and communities. In spite of this history and in spite of this poverty, there's a lot of good news in Central Appalachia as well. Over the last 15 years, we have built a broad-based movement that most call the Equitable Appalachian Transition. This transition is working to build a new economy and to solve those entrenched issues that continue to hold back progress in the region. You can see some of the new economic work here on the slide. We have a thriving local food sector and clean energy sector. We have an amazing amount of new manufacturing and worker-owned businesses across the region. We have an emerging tech sector. Our health industry is expanding. Tourism is expanding. And our young people are now staying in the region and coming back to the region to really be a part of this renaissance and the transition. Within this broader transition movement, we have a historical, innovative, and thriving arts and culture and creative placemaking sector. We see this sector as really the heart and soul of the transition. It is what's bringing back our cultural pride. It is what's advancing our economic development efforts, and it is what's changing the narrative of Central Appalachia. I'm going to let Stephanie talk a lot further about this sector, and I'm going to end my talk about the context now and switch gears with you and talk just a little bit about the Appalachia Funders Network. So what makes the Appalachia Funders Network unique? It's a really movement-building effort. It really is an effort to organize and align grant makers and investors toward this notion of an equitable Appalachian transition. It's member-driven by the interest and the leadership of the folks who are involved. We have about 65 paid members in the Funders Network. Those members run the gamut from very small community foundations all the way to large national funders, to CDFIs, to impact investors, to federal and state agencies. The network has been around since 2010. It got started as a response to the economic crisis. We have a fairly straightforward mission in that to accelerate the economic Appalachian transition by convening and connecting funders for learning, analysis, and collaboration. Over the last 10 years, we've done four main things. We've helped to build strong relationships and trust, which is probably the most important thing that we've done across the region. We've helped to facilitate a common analysis, understanding, and vision so that everybody is heading down a similar path, sort of similar vision for the future. We've helped to facilitate cross-sector connections and collaborations, which has resulted in the 7 organized groups of funders and investors. And we've helped to align our existing resources, because we have a lot of them in the region, and we've helped to leverage new investments into this notion of an Appalachian transition. All of that work has resulted in a structure that looks something like this. We have a strong steering committee who really guides the work of the network. We play the backbone support role that sort of wakes up every day and thinks about how to develop this work. And then we have 7 very well-organized working groups that all represent various parts of what's needed to transition our economy forward. These working groups both develop a deeper analysis of their sector or their issue. They work to align their individual grant making and investments toward a larger regional vision, and they create a platform for outside funders and investors to come into the region with an automatic set of partners, analysis, and connections to the ground. A few years ago, we recognized that we were missing a piece of infrastructure, so we created this thing called Invest Appalachia, which is really a platform to catch outside investment, impact investing money, that then works with grant makers to blend investing and grant making together to be able to do projects that we weren't able to do before. If you think about the work of these working groups over a longer period of time, this is what our theory of change looks like, and I'm going to focus on the top part of this slide. Obviously, all of our working groups invest in grantees and partners to advance the work of the region, and if you look across all of the work that's happening out of the Funders Network, we believe that we're making three main contributions to this overall notion of an equitable Appalachian transition. The first, on the left-hand side, is creating a more diverse and resilient local economy. We're pushing more jobs and business development, the growth of promising economic sectors, building a stronger entrepreneur ecosystem, revitalizing downtowns and infrastructure. Second is solving those entrenched problems that continue to hold back the region, bringing more investments into Central Appalachia, improving the image and the narrative, creating more community capacity and leadership, creating a healthier population, and moving more equitable policies and systems. And last but certainly not least is the preservation and the full utilization of our cultural, natural, and artistic assets. That looks like improved landscapes, increased cultural pride, and a robust arts and culture sector that both promotes the region, drives the economy, and strengthens our communities. This isn't the only things that need to be done to transition Central Appalachia, but these are the three main contributions that we believe the Appalachia Funders Network is making to this overall effort. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Stephanie Hyre and let her talk more deeply about the Arts and Culture Group, which is a core part of making this transition happen. So, Stephanie?
Thanks, Thomas. Well, thanks for having me today, y'all. My name is Stephanie Hyre, and I'm Senior Program Officer at Greater Kanawha Valley Foundation. And I'm here to talk to you mostly about my work with the Arts and Culture Working Group of the Appalachia Funders Network. As Thomas said, you know, the network has various issue-based groups that focus on addressing some of these deep-rooted challenges that Appalachia faces, including, as Thomas mentioned, decline of the coal industry, pervasive public health issues, undervaluing of natural resources. And a couple years ago, in 2017, a group of funders at one of the network's gatherings came together and asked the question, you know, how does art and culture respond to these challenges and help capitalize on the region's leadership and vision to empower healthy communities and locally rooted economies. And so for the last couple of years, there's been a group of us who have developed a case statement around our work in arts and culture and an effort to answer that question. You know, how do arts drive this equitable transition? So our case statement you can find on the Appalachia Funders Network website. It has three main focus areas, and I'll give you a little definition of each of those. Creative placemaking, arts education, and cultural heritage. So I will say that the majority of our work has been focused primarily on creative placemaking of those three focus areas. That's happened pretty organically. That's just where the most energy and momentum that we've found among the funders we work with and the practitioners on the ground. But knowing that creative placemaking is a little differently defined for all of us and can have kind of a academic flavor to it, I put here on the slide how we're defining it. You know, it's what happens when residents use arts and culture to tell the story of what's unique about a place, drive economic development, improve quality of life, and inspire hope for their community or region. And it was important to us to have a shared definition and understanding of what we meant by that term. And I'll get into how we came up with that definition here in just a little bit. This next slide talks a little bit about arts and culture, our arts education focus and cultural heritage. Our group looks at arts education as both a K through 12 strategy that helps develop creative thinkers, but also it's lately had more of an emphasis on entrepreneurial education for working artists, including business skills, connecting with larger markets, financing and loans, etc. And we believe that investment in these areas will, over the long term, result in a better educated workforce and more entrepreneurship. An example of what's happening in this arts education work is, you know, with emerging artist fellowships, the increased technical assistance and training that we're seeing throughout the region, as well as our community and technical colleges getting focused on design and artist entrepreneurship. Cultural heritage, you know, one of the core issues that continues to undermine our work in the Appalachian transition is a long-standing negative perception of Appalachia. So the arts and culture group of the network was really interested in how we could lift up an accurate, locally created narrative that demonstrates Central Appalachia's rich artistic and creative history that has for a long time challenged structural inequities and been a voice for positive social change. More recently, we've been focusing on really 4 bodies of work, and our activities have centralized around those. A strategic communications project, lifting up stories in the region, learning across funders and engaging state arts agencies, getting a common analysis of what was happening with individual artists and creative placemaking efforts in the region through field scan, and then organizing partners on the ground to address some of those recommendations that were discovered in that scan. The first one that I'll talk about is that strategic communications project. We wanted to really lift up the arts and culture work that was underway in the region. We thought it was important that the stories come from a local writer, so we commissioned an Appalachian from Eastern Tennessee to write 20 brief summaries and 5 longer profiles of projects across the region that integrate arts and culture into their community economic development work. We're hoping to bring attention to the ways that arts and culture can integrate into just about any sector and across equitable transition issues in Appalachia. We wanted to help funders who don't typically fund in arts and culture to understand how using arts strategies can amplify project impact in new ways. We wanted to share perspectives of how projects can be funded. So in each of these profile pieces, you'll hear from the artists on the ground doing the work, the agencies and community partners who helped them, and then also the funders that helped invest and support the project along the way. And it was important to us that we showed how arts was intersecting with some of the existing groups that were already a part of the Appalachia Funders Network, including energy and natural resources, food and agriculture, downtown revitalization, equity, community capacity, and others. So what came out of that focus was a really great book called The Stories of the Power of Art, How Appalachian People Use Art to Make Change. I think y'all have access to it through the Grantmakers in the Arts webinar registration, and I can certainly drop a link there in the chat here shortly. I am so excited about this project. It highlights really creative stories from across the region, Black Soil, Our Better Nature, weaving storytelling and community building and culture into reclaiming Black Kentuckians' agricultural heritage and culinary arts, the Cattywampus Puppet Parade, the ways that energy and natural resources, food systems, and agriculture, how all of those are being informed and led by community-driven strategies that include artists at the forefront. So I could go on for days about those, but I will keep moving. Another one of the things that the Arts and Culture Group has been doing is these peer learning exchanges with state arts agencies. The goal was to learn more about the work that was being funded through public dollars, the kinds of projects that were occurring in arts and culture, and what was not being funded in arts and culture by those government agencies, and just get a more and better understanding of the arts and culture landscape in Appalachia, including its challenges and assets. Of course, part of the network is building relationships and trust among Appalachia funders and really fostering those cross-sector connections and collaborations, which we felt, as we looked around the table, we saw a lot of community-based or place-based funders and private foundations, but we wanted to align our resources and leverage new investments with those public dollars as well. So we've had a few of those to date, and we've also gotten some more folks to join the group and the Appalachia Funders Network, the West Virginia Humanities Council, the Ohio Arts Council. We just had a great meeting with Tennessee Arts Commission, so really trying to foster those cross-funder collaborations. Another thing that we've been doing is working with a practitioner network, the Central Appalachian Network. I like to think of it as the sister network to the funder network in Appalachia. One of the Arts and Culture Group members, a foundation, a national funder, commissioned the Central Appalachia Network to do a field scan of the region to gather some case studies, do some interviews, and really just do some arts mapping around what the challenges and the assets were in the region as it related to arts and culture work and lifting up individual artists. They uncovered a few challenges in that funding is sparse and targets strategies that are unrealistic in rural areas. In terms of philanthropic support to Appalachia, there's a real dearth of that in the region. One of the strategies that they offered up was having some seed investments for flexible funding. There's been a reliance on extractive industries that's led to a lack of creative self-determination. In a lot of ways, we're facing an economic crisis, but also a crisis of the imagination, as West Virginia writer Catherine Moore puts it. Creative talent in Central Appalachia is underutilized. The geographic isolation makes it more difficult to spread ideas, and lack of connection between rural artists and larger markets. You see on the slide here a framework of what creative placemaking looks like in Central Appalachia. From that field scan done by the Central Appalachian Network, they came up with, through those interviews and case studies and the data they collected through surveys, several principles that are occurring in Central Appalachia when we do this creative placemaking work. Engaging artists in creative strategies, so recognizing and using the perspectives, tools, and capabilities of artists and creativity to bring people together. The need to honor culture, identity, and place, lifting up that diversity of cultures and livelihoods, and creating economic development opportunities leads to growth in business and jobs that will result in additional creative endeavors. So grounded in those principles, the scan offers up a variety of strategies and tactics, often simultaneously, in order to advance the community development goals. And so you have a list of those there, including narrative and storytelling, public art, building rehabilitation, assisting artists in their entrepreneurial pursuits, and treating art as a business, a small business, and helping them grow. And so I will move on from there. I can also drop a link to the Central Appalachian Network field study into the chat. I think you had access to that as well. So there you see some recommendations that came out of that study, including increased investments in community design solutions, training communities in artistic strategies, changing the narrative around the relevance of arts, and I would say changing the narrative around what and who Appalachia is in general, and promoting peer learning and field building. So, a couple of the members of the arts and culture group then got together and decided to fund some of these projects using the recommendations from the field scan as the basis for that investment. So now we have a group of, I believe, about 10 different organizations. They're functioning as a learning cohort, receiving capacity building, sharing equitable practices, and learning how to tie placemaking work to broader economic development strategies. So it's really a part of a field building effort that is a direct result of our involvement with the network. The last thing I'll mention is that Greater Kanawha Valley Foundation is doing some creative placemaking work that was really informed by our relationship with Appalachia Funders Network and the members there. We used the Artist Thrive instrument from Arts and Culture Working Group member Emily Hall Tremaine Foundation, and hired someone to just broker relationships between artists, businesses, and communities. You see there painting by Ian Bodie, who's a West Virginia artist here. So there's been a lot of response to the recent climate in the region, including Black Lives Matter, and of course artists responding to the COVID-19 pandemic through that initiative. I have a list here of folks who are part of the Appalachia Funders Network Arts and Culture Group. You can see we have a nice diversity between place-based funders, local funders, government entities, and private philanthropy as well. I will stop there. I think my time is up, but certainly if you have any questions, feel free to reach out to me. I have my email address there. Oh, and I will turn it over now to Roy Agloinga from the Rasmuson Foundation out of Alaska.
Thank you so much. Enzina and I are very, very happy to join you today. I want to thank Enzina for doing so much work in pulling this whole presentation together. We're glad we get to talk with you a little bit today. I want to do a quick shout out before we start to Jason Smart, who I saw is online. He's a he's a director with the MAC Foundation, and he was instrumental in really framing and forming our arts initiative and turning it into an actual program at Rasmussen. So first of all, today we'd like to welcome you to our presentation to talk about arts and arts across Alaska. And we have, one of the first things that we need to do is a land acknowledgement. So, this is a place that was traditionally occupied by the Dena'ina people from Agloinga, and they still live in this area. This is still considered their place. So we're very happy to be able to talk from that space. And again, my name is Roy Agloinga. I'm a program officer with Rasmuson Foundation. I've been at the foundation for a little over 5 years. I've been involved in various efforts in the Arts Initiative, and I'm very happy to be with you today. I'm originally from rural Alaska and from a small village of 200 people, no roads, very limited access, and Alaska is such a unique place to work in, so we're really excited about presenting today.
Hi, everyone. My name is Enzina Marrari, and I am also a program officer at the Rasmussen Foundation. I'm also a practicing artist, and in my role in the foundation, I co-manage the Individual Artist Awards program, which we'll be talking about, and I co-manage that with our colleague, Charity Summer. We also wanted to introduce the third individual you see in the picture, that's our colleague, Tanya Dumas, who oversees our Tier 1 grant program. So before we get started today, we just wanted to take a moment to recognize that we are still living in a time of civil unrest around racial justice and equity across our country. And we stand with our communities of color in dismantling institutional and systemic racism. So one way we wanted to introduce you all to arts across Alaska and the type of art that you might encounter in our state is by introducing you to a contemporary Inuit musical and performance group, Pamua.
My name is Asanak Kairayoko Asi. I'm with Pamio. I was born in Bethel, grew up in the village of Chefornik. My Yupik name is Asanak. My parents only spoke Yupik at the home, so I'm very lucky and blessed to have been around that. I grew up dancing all my life. I thought the entire planet did exact same things. And I call home Anchorage now after I graduated from UAF in '91. After I moved down here, I started dancing again and gradually moved into drumming. And from there, I've been drumming ever since. The other members are Philip and Stephen Blanchett. They're brothers. Stephen is the older one. Philip is the younger one. He's the one that holds our group together, and Stephen is more of the front man at the stage. And Karina is also another singer. I myself have, the traditional upbringing and raising, and the language and the dance and whatnot. So we all blend nicely together. I hope our audience walk away fulfilled. Music has no boundaries because we speak a language that's universal.
We are so grateful for Kanawha's artistry and for helping to tell the story of Alaska through their work. So with the time we have with you today, we want to introduce you a little bit to Alaska, tell you a brief history of the Rasmuson Foundation and our Arts and Culture Initiative, introduce you to the individual artist awards, provide you with some resources, and then happily take any questions that you have.
Alaska is a region that is huge, and it's actually broken up into several different cultural groups. 5 major native language groups with many, many subgroups within each of those 5 major language groups. So we recognize that when we're working in this state, we're working, if we go from one region to the other, they're vastly different in language and culture, in the kind of foods they eat, and the economy and access to art.
You know, Alaska is truly an indigenous place and is home to 40% of federally recognized tribes in the United States. And even though Alaska is home to 40% of those tribes, 78% of Alaska Native people live and reside in rural Alaska, which is the western portion of the state. And unfortunately, it's also one of the most impacted areas in the country. And this really plays into issues that we'll talk about later on around access and connection. Some quick facts about Alaska. Roy mentioned how large the state is, and throughout our state, the U.S. Census really only recognized 2 urban areas. And so when we think about rural versus urban versus suburban, Alaska really recognizes that differently. In Alaska, we really only see urban and rural. We don't really have a recognized suburban area. The 2 urban areas in Alaska are Anchorage and Fairbanks. Our foundation is based in Anchorage, though we are statewide, and those are the most densely populated areas of the state. There are 13 other areas that are considered urban clusters, but what's interesting is that even within those urban clusters, some of those cities will still be qualified as rural Alaska. On the map, you might be able to see Bethel, which is considered an urban cluster, but also considered a rural area. And within that designation of rural, there are a couple different ways of recognizing those rural areas. Bush communities, which are communities that would not be connected to the road system or the ferry system, and hub communities. And hub communities are a little bit larger cities that really connect and provide access to villages. And Anchorage, which is one of those 2 urban centers, is recognized as one of the most diverse cities in the nation. And this is a surprising fact for a lot of folks who reside outside of Alaska. But at any given time in Anchorage, you would have access to hearing about 100 first languages that are spoken. And in Anchorage, we are home to the nation's 19 most diverse schools. So there is a lot of diversity within Anchorage and within Alaska. And in addition to that, even though Anchorage is the most diverse city in the nation, we still see about 67% of the population in Anchorage as white.
So you could fit Texas into Alaska 2 times. It is 1/5 the size of the lower 48. Alaska is bigger than Texas, California, and Montana combined in area. Our foundation grants to 12 distinct regions in Alaska, and each of those regions has school districts and regional native for-profit and non-profit organizations that provide services similar to a borough government. Each region has distinct cultures, languages, environments. There are, again, Most of these places have no roads. Goods in rural Alaska are 3 to 5 times more expensive than in Anchorage. So if you buy a bucket of soap in Anchorage for $5, it could easily be $15 to $20 in any one of our rural hubs. We've had a tremendous impact of colonization in Alaska with outside forces such as churches, schools, and the government, which have been working hard to colonize Alaska from the 1700s with the first incursion from the Russian imperial government. The impacts have been tremendous. We've had like incredible loss of language and culture. It has impacted the economy, the subsistence ability for people to get and gather food in rural areas. The education system is still completely outside of Anchorage, run almost entirely by non-Native people, with the majority of students being Native people. So the history is has been tremendously impacted by colonization. And it has had some specific impacts on art and expression in rural Alaska. For instance, in Canada, the Inuit still show spiritual form when they're carving and they're drawing and painting. You see the spirit form of animals, which is a very traditional frame of art in traditional Inuit society. In Alaska, we made cribbage boards because we knew that that's what would sell to gold miners and to white people who were coming to the country. So the impact has been tremendous, and yet there are many, many efforts to address colonization and decolonization through exhibits at like art galleries like the Bunnell Street Art Gallery in Homer, the Katurvik Culture Center in Nome, the Alaska Native Heritage Center here in Anchorage. They all have worked hard to really present a true expression of what Alaska Native people are and who they are. First Alaskans and Native Movement are two organizations that have also been doing a lot of work in the last several years on not just decolonization, but racial justice. Rasmuson Foundation started in 1955 when Jenny Olson Rasmussen, along with her son Elmer, created the foundation to honor her late husband, E.A. Rasmussen. On his 90th birthday in 1999, Elmer Rasmussen and his wife, Mary Louise, announced a gift of $50 million to the Anchorage Museum and $40 million to Rasmussen Foundation. In 2000, the family sold the National Bank of Alaska to Wells Fargo, and Elmer Rasmussen left most of his estate to the foundation.
And arts and culture have been integral to the Rasmussen family since those early times. In fact, Elmer was a big supporter of traditional arts and Indigenous arts and would buy art directly from artists. And this collection actually grew into the Alaska Heritage Museum, which is currently housed in the Wells Fargo Bank. And so it wasn't a surprise that in 2003, the board decided to make a 10-year, $20 million investment into arts and culture. And this birthed the Arts and Culture Initiative. And this initiative had three main arms, and that was funding directly to artists, funding to organizations, and funding to the community. And these three different branches of grant making came to about 1/4 of the foundation's annual investment in arts and culture. And this arts and culture investment was really seen as a way to strengthen Alaska's cultural resources and support the creative economy.
We have had great success in creating partnerships across all of our grant making, and we found that within our arts and culture programs, there was really no other way to deliver the kind of funding that we wanted to across Alaska. We couldn't do it in-house anymore. It was too difficult. So we partnered with the Alaska State Council on the Arts, and they have been incredible at being able to have a very broad and very deep reach with our funding in the areas of touring and arts and education.
And we'll really briefly introduce you to three of those community programs that the Alaska State Council on the Arts administers at their space. And one of those is the Harper Arts Touring Fund. And this fund was really established in recognition of the broad geography of Alaska and the challenges with accessibility and connection. And so this fund is provided to organizations that help to tour performing arts and musical groups throughout the state, and specifically to areas that have underrepresentation and that might not otherwise be exposed to these different types of art forms. The two other programs that really impact the community investments are cultural collaborations and arts and education. And these are both youth-focused. And in cultural collaborations, this is a grant to organizations to work with artists that can teach youth cultural arts. And this is outside of the school year and is an ongoing way to immerse students and youth in cultural expression. Arts and education occurs during the school year, and it was really a way to integrate arts in the curriculum throughout schools in Alaska. And this program supports 2-week-long artist residencies within the school, so students, again, get that real immersive arts experience.
We have partnered also with another statewide organization, Museums Alaska, who have helped us to really build on art acquisition through an art acquisition fund, which helps museums and culture centers, acquire art by currently practicing Alaska-based artists. And that fund has also been helped with a collections management fund to support these museums and culture centers manage these collections that, when we started the program, we really didn't anticipate that there was that the issue of having collections and having ways to store them and manage them and upkeep them. But that fund has also merged into assisting with that.
And one of the other 3 ways that the foundation focused the arts and culture investments is in the Individual Artist Awards program. And this is really the only grant making that the foundation does directly to individuals. And before we talk a little bit about that, we wanted to introduce you to one of our 2020 Individual Artist Award recipients, Crystal Worrell.
Ka kia yuchat duasog, yech ayachat lukahadi nachatsati, ashna dakahidi echet, shangu khwedi yadi ayachat, gonana nachatsati. My Tlingit name is Ka Kia. My English name is Crystal Worrell. I am Tlingit, Athabaskan, and Yupik from Juneau, Alaska. It is with great honor that I accept the Individual Artist Award from the Rasmuson Foundation. With this award, I plan to create a mural downtown in honor of my clan member, Elizabeth Peradovich, a human rights activist who fought hard on behalf of Alaska Native identity and rights and advocated for the Anti-Discrimination Act in the 1940s. Gunlchish to the Rasmuson Foundation for supporting artists like me.
We are so excited to support Crystal in her work this year. So the Individual Artist Awards program, again, is the only program that the foundation supports that funds individuals directly. And, in thinking about the mission of the Rasmuson Foundation, it's really to make a better life for Alaskans, and art is integral to that. The Individual Artist Awards supports 3 different grant types depending on artist career. It is open to all artist stages, so artists who are emerging, mid-career, or mature. The program supports individual artists, and new this year, the program also recognizes artist groups and collaboratives. And that was really assessed by listening to the needs of artists and really wanting to accommodate the collaborative nature of artwork. The program supports the full range of disciplines, is intended for artistic work, not scholarly work or commercial work. And in addition to a monetary award, artists are provided with professional development. And again, this was in response to artist needs and surveying artists on what they were missing with their individual professional development. In thinking about how we can constantly reevaluate and access the program, my colleague Charity and I reviewed our program from last year and looked at where the applications were coming from. And we saw that a majority of the applications we were receiving were from urban centers and those urban clusters that we mentioned. And we were seeing few applications from rural Alaska. And so we really wanted to look at how we could improve our rural outreach to hopefully increase accessibility for rural artists and create connections. And we looked at this in a four-way strategy.
So growing partnerships was an important strategy for our rural outreach because we recognize that there's no way that we could continue to do this work without having those particular people within our rural communities that we can talk to and who can help us to reach out to artists. And we recognize that, a lot of that is because there are unique barriers that exist in rural Alaska, such as Wi-Fi connection or being able to get pictures of work and even being able to, for artists to be able to market their work, it's almost impossible without some sort of connection to the urban areas where people want to buy art.
And Alaska is a really interesting and remote and vast place. And so we work with outside panelists that review all of the individual artist award applications. And we want to make sure that we're providing education and training for those panelists so they understand artists and what it's like to be making work and making art in Alaska. Additionally, we want to be responsible stewards of Indigenous culture and values and address issues that arise. And one of those issues that we faced in Alaska is cultural appropriation or the inappropriate adoption of Indigenous art forms or practices by someone who is not Indigenous. And so we work with artists to provide education and information about what cultural appropriation is. And this year we contracted with a cultural expert and strategist, Sonia Guinnessaka, who helped us to review applications that could potentially be problematic. One of the last things we want to mention before we get to questions is how important it is to listen to the needs of artists and be responsive to that. And that is how we developed the Arts and Culture Initiative, was by listening to artists, by talking with organizations, by surveying, and really questioning the field so we can respond better. Also being able to be flexible with your funding and investments to respond accordingly. Something that we've looked at this year during the pandemic is how we could provide emergency resources to artists and create a different strategy for responding to the pandemic this upcoming year. Two resources that have been provided, and we can make sure we put them in the chat box, is the Alaska Native Resource Workbook, which was developed by the Hyre Foundation and the Alaska State Council on the Arts, and then the Grant Writing Handbook. And this was specific for rural artists, and that was developed by the Hyre Foundation and the First Peoples Cultural Council of British Columbia. So with that, we welcome and will happily answer any questions that you have. Thank you so much for your time today.
Great, thank you. Those were great presentations from all of you. I love hearing about the various Central Appalachia working groups and specifically how you channeled creative placemaking and cultural heritage and the entrepreneurship training for artists, which is incredible when we think about investing in the creative economy. So I thought that was fantastic. And then also in the Rasmuson Foundation, your presentation, you're speaking about the history of Alaska. That was critical because, we know that not only in Alaska, but the world really is sort of in the same space of colonization and the need to decolonize. And it has a lot to do with how our world functions and how our nation functions now. So I appreciate you raising that. And so we do have some questions starting to come in. So I want to pivot us there. If you have questions, those of you who are attending, you can feel free to use the chat box, the Q&A box to the bottom of your screen. This first question, I'll direct it to all of you, if you have any insight on this particular one. Someone asked, what type of corporate support is available for the arts in rural communities, if you have a sense of where this person might start? any of you can answer that one.
I'll start. This is Roy. In Alaska, each of our regions has a for-profit Native corporation, and these 12 Native corporations have become integral to Alaska's economy. They deal in a lot of different areas of resource development, but they've also created a very broad and varied business model. They are some of the folks that right now are buying most of the art from rural artists, which, we didn't anticipate that. It's very surprising. And they have become a regional engine for making sure that rural artists are getting money for their work.
Great. All righty. All right, we'll go to our next question, and this is actually for you, Thomas and Stephanie. So we did talk about the movement for Black Lives. Briefly, both of you mentioned it earlier, but more specifically, when we think about we're also in the midst of a global pandemic, so what role are the arts and artists playing in response to the coronavirus pandemic response effort and the movement for racial justice?
This is Stephanie. I can start and then maybe kick it over to Thomas, but
Sure.
I will say when we commissioned the writer to collect all of the stories that you'll find in that Stories of the Power of Art in Appalachia, we did so before the pandemic really brought our economy and in-person activities to a halt, and before that racial injustice and attention on that began creating new opportunities for fixing some of those broken systems. But I think you'll find in those stories that the healing power of art and how the folks in Appalachia, despite maybe national narratives about who we are lifting up Black voices and supporting that work, as well as just being creative in terms of pivoting performances into a virtual format or we have a group called Holler Mask Force, in West Virginia. We have the Hills and the Halls who are, creating masks, and just a ragtag group of makers and organizers, as well as, various makers like the Wild Rose Soap Company in Shepherdstown, West Virginia, who's collecting donated bottles of alcohol to make hand sanitizer and distribute for free. So I think we're seeing artists get creative despite the current working environment. Now I'll shift over to Thomas in case you have something to add.
Yeah, a couple of things there. I'll come back to the Greater Kanawha Valley Foundation and the Racial Justice Summit that y'all pulled off last week. So the foundation had about 850 people from across the region show up to a virtual Racial Justice Summit. One of the products of that summit was an artist did a drawing of the entire meeting. And so instead of having a long report that came out of that, we have a beautiful, I don't know, Stephanie, what do you call that? I know there's a name for it. It was absolutely amazing. It told the whole story of the meeting itself.
Sort of like an infographic type thing?
Yeah, it came out to be.
It was a graphic recording, yeah.
Yeah, did it real time. It was absolutely fantastic. The other thing that we're seeing across Central Appalachia, which has not gotten as much attention as we'd like, is that there's been a tremendous amount of protest marches in small towns that you would never think that would happen in rural America. So we've had lots of small marches around the racial justice movement across Central Appalachia. We see a lot of puppetry in those. We see a lot of murals that's happening across the region in response to the racial justice movement. And we're seeing a lot of arts and discussion, happening. There are groups like Riff Raff Arts Collective out of Princeton, West Virginia there, who's now doing a weekly art show and discussion that's coming out of all of this kind of work. So there's a lot of really interesting ways that folks are using art to both paint the picture of what is happening in the region, provide hope for the future of this region, and to engage in some pretty interesting and sometimes challenging dialogue across rural America.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you both. I'm going to kick it over to Roy and Enzina. So how can foundations support arts and culture in rural communities as critical to the well-being of the entire state?
One of the things that we've recognized at Rasmuson Foundation is that we have a very deep and broad connection to our grantees, and we've really felt that it's been so important for us to nurture that. Unlike some other foundations that really don't talk to their grantees, we have made a point of being on the phone. So sometimes we get 10 to 20 calls a week from grantees. And I think in our arts program, if artists are having trouble filling out paperwork, if they are having bad Wi-Fi connections, we make so many accommodations to help them, connect with our funding. But we also will reach out, and the Rasmussen family, many of whom sit on our board, buy art wherever we go, whichever region we travel to. They will, purchase art and recognize artists. And when we see artists that are important, that are struggling, we really try to connect them, not just with our funding, but also, with economic opportunity.
Mm-hmm. That's great. Enzina, do you want to add on?
Sure. I don't have much to add, but I think that piece about creating those connections through partnerships and through developing deep relationships is so essential. And, one of the questions that we ask ourselves is, even in our individual artist award application process, we recognize it's a very Western approach. The entire application process is geared in that way. And we ask the questions, how can we make this more accessible? Roy mentioned connectivity issues. Just to give some context of what that looks like in Alaska, we were doing a workshop in Dillingham where, we were talking to artists about uploading images and into the application website platform, and it was taking them 10 minutes to upload one photograph. And so when you're talking about uploading 10, it creates a really big barrier. And so these are questions we're still asking ourselves. How can we adapt and change our processes to be more inclusive and to be more accessible? And we don't have all the answers, but we know it starts with those conversations, and it starts with building those relationships.
Yeah, and so I want to stay with you both, Roy and Enzina, and my next question for you kind of speaks to your mentioning of, or yours and Roy's mentioning of partnership and how essential it is. So how can funders protect, connect, and nurture rural arts and culture? And so you mentioned partnership, but say more about that.
Sure. So, part of that is developing those partnerships. Part of that is recognizing that, the foundation is based in Anchorage, and we don't know what's happening in other areas, and so we want to create those partnerships with foundations or organizations that are in those areas that are doing that work, so we can be the best stewards of Indigenous and Alaska Native culture and values. I also think recognizing, Roy mentioned this, that we aren't really the ones doing the work, and we recognize that we're not always experts in this, and so seeking, pooling our resources to find who those experts are. And one way within the Individual Artist Award program that we're looking at protecting our rural artists and our rural areas is really around that issue of cultural appropriation. And this has come throughout Alaska in many different organizations. And we recognize that it's an education piece, it's an awareness piece. And so something that we want to do is make sure we're providing that awareness and education to our artists in our community, but also being responsible in the art that ends up getting funded. And so we looked at this last year and thought, how can we be better? How can we be more responsible stewards? We are not the experts of cultural appropriation or cultural strategy in this way. And so we worked with someone who was an expert and contracted with them to review any of the applications that we saw that were potentially problematic. We provided that feedback to our panelists. We provided that feedback to the artists as well. so that we could be the most responsible stewards of cultural practices and art forms.
Mm-hmm.
You know, Stephanie, one other thing that we do that I think that is really important to mention is that we support art associations. We recognize that a lot of the answers lie in the arts community, and the artists in each region have formed associations and collectives that are not always formal, but we tap into them to try to get any kind of changes. And I feel like Enzina and Charity in our Individual Arts Award program have been really critical in doing that work because they have the biggest reach out into villages and into rural areas. But like in Nome, they have a folk fest that goes for 2 days, and the Arts Council there does it all by volunteer. And so if we want to learn more about what's happening in Nome and how we can better support that work, you know, this 2-day folk fest, we have to talk to the folks there who run the Arts Council, who are all volunteers, and find out from them how we can better support the effort.
All right. That's great. Thank you both. It is the top of the hour, and we have a few more questions. So what I'll do is I've switched the slides so that you all can see the email addresses of our presenters, and I'll also send the remaining questions to all of you who presented as well, so that you can share your responses. So I'll keep this up here. But we have reached the end of the presentation. So I want to thank again Roy, Stephanie, Enzina, and Thomas. Your presentations were fantastic, and I'm looking forward to hearing more about what you're doing out in Alaska and Central Appalachia, and going more deeply into the resources that you shared, which we also have posted on our website. And today's presentation has been recorded, so we'll be sending you all who attended a link to the recording file and the presentation slides within the next few days. We also invite you to take a brief survey that we will share immediately following the webinar, because we want to know what you thought. We hope you will visit and keep the conversation going on how we can reimagine the future of philanthropy while, of course, keeping a racial equity lens. And if you have further questions, you can feel free to reach out to me, Sherilyn Seeley. And we thank you again for joining us. Have a great day.